G'day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining me once again for another episode of the Big Bad Brad Show MMA edition. My name is Brad Williams, and every week I aim to provide you with a fan's eye view of the sport of mixed martial arts from way up the back in the cheap seats. I know I say it every week, but I really do appreciate you checking out the podcast, and obviously you found us somehow. But we are on Facebook. Just head to facebook.com/Big Bad Brad MMA. You can find us on Twitter at Big Bad Brad MMA. And very exciting, last week we also launched our YouTube channel. So if you just search Big Bad Brad Show MMA on YouTube, you'll be able to find us, no dramas at all. It's been another huge week in the sport of mixed martial arts, so we're going to jump straight into it. And speaking of huge, a sensational fight announcement broke just this morning, Australian time. UFC lightweight champion Rafael dos Anjos will be defending his lightweight championship of the world against former Bellator lightweight champion Eddie Alvarez in what is shaping up to be a gigantic weekend in Las Vegas in July. It's scheduled to take place on a UFC Fight Pass card on Friday the 8th of July, Australian time, which is the event that will kick off a gigantic weekend. So now, if you can wrap your head around this, we've got Rafael dos Anjos versus Eddie Alvarez for the lightweight title on Friday, as I say, Australian time. Saturday will be the Ultimate Fighter finale with Joanna Jędrzejczyk defending her UFC strawweight championship against Claudia Gadelha. And then on Sunday, Australian time, it will be UFC 200, which you already know about. And if you don't, you've been living under a rock. So July is a sensational time to be an MMA fan or a fight fan in general. And Rafael dos Anjos versus Eddie Alvarez is just going to be a great fight. It's such a sensational addition to what is already a jam-packed weekend. So that was huge news that broke overnight, and very, very exciting stuff. Of course, last weekend, UFC made their debut in Croatia. It was UFC Fight Night Zagreb. Some great fights that came out of the night. But afterwards, all anyone was talking about was the heavyweights, and with very good reason. The co-main event saw Derek Lewis taking on former UFC heavyweight title challenger Gabriel Gonzaga. It was the classic story of the grizzled vet taking on the up-and-comer in Derek Lewis. And, whew, my goodness, Derek Lewis. You give him room and that dude will punch your face off. The fight started with Gonzaga working his clinch game up against the cage. It looked like he might have been trying to tire out Derek Lewis. And then Derek Lewis found a little bit of space and thought, let me just see what I can do from out here. And the next thing you know, Gonzaga was out like a light. Shortly after that fight, Derek Lewis was very quick to call out Big Country Roy Nelson in what would be an explosive heavyweight affair. Derek Lewis obviously is high on confidence. His power is just ridiculous, but Big Country would be a huge step up in competition. There's no doubt about that. Don't let his physique fool you. Roy Nelson is legit. He's as legitimate as anyone in the UFC's heavyweight division. He's got exceptional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's just that we never get to see it because he's got ridiculous one-punch knockout power. Having said that, when the heavyweights are that big and they're swinging that hard, anything can happen. So if Derek Lewis and Roy Big Country Nelson was to be the next fight for both those gentlemen, there'd be a lot of eyeballs on that fight, including my own. I think that would be a very, very exciting affair. Speaking of the heavyweights, the main event from UFC Zagreb saw former UFC heavyweight champion of the world, Junior Dos Santos, take on the juggernaut of the heavyweight division in Big Ben Rothwell. There was a lot of chatter before that fight that if Big Ben could pick up the victory, he would definitely put himself into the conversation as far as being the next in line for a shot at the UFC Heavyweight Championship. But someone forgot to share those plans with Junior Dos Santos because he went off script in a big way. Just showed his exceptional boxing game, worked the body of Big Ben. He was cutting angles. He was using his footwork exceptionally, and it just put on a stellar performance and reminded everybody of why he's the former heavyweight champion and why he could very well be a future heavyweight champion once again. The big moment to come out of the fight was, of course, that gigantic Sparta kick that sent Big Ben halfway across the octagon. Just an outstanding performance from Junior Dos Santos, and he definitely announced his arrival back in the pointy end of that heavyweight division. And that's the thing with a division like the heavyweights, there are so many fighters that are coming into their own at the same time. Obviously, and I've said it before on the podcast, I really think that if Cain Velasquez defeats Travis Browne at UFC 200, he will fight the winner of Fabricio Verdum and Stipe Miocic. But, if Travis Brown is able to get over Cain Velasquez, then it blows the division wide open. Travis Brown, obviously, could make a claim for being the number one contender. Depending on how the fight goes between Stipe and Fabricio Verdum, you never know. There may be a rematch there. You just don't know how things are going to pan out. Junior, now, obviously, can put his hand up. I'd love to see the Super Samoan Mark Hunt challenge for the heavyweight title. If Alistair Overeem gets over Andrei Arlovski in Amsterdam, then he obviously can lay a claim to being the number one contender. So it's very, very exciting times in the UFC heavyweight division. It's a great time to be a fight fan and a great time to be a heavyweight, particularly if you're winning. So watch this space because there's some fantastic fights coming up. Speaking of fantastic fights, I was very, very excited this week with the announcement that the prodigy, BJ Penn, is finally making his UFC return. For people that don't know, BJ Penn is my favourite fighter of all time across any form of combat sport. I love BJ Penn. I think he's a fighter's fighter. He's a legitimate legend. He really is. When fighters say, I'll fight anyone, I'll take on anybody, anywhere, anytime. It doesn't mean anything. You're just saying something. It's like when a girl says, I don't care what a guy looks like. It's all about what's on the inside. It's like, really? How many short, fat, bald dudes have you been with? What? None? When you put it that way, it almost makes it sound like you're full of shit. But when BJ Penn says that he will fight anybody, he truly means he will fight anybody. You've only got to look at his fight resume. He's one of only two men, along with Randy Couture, to ever be a two-division world champion in the UFC. He's been the UFC lightweight champion and the UFC welterweight champion. He defeated Matt Hughes to become the UFC welterweight champion. He fought Renzo Gracie at middleweight. He famously fought Lyoto Machida at heavyweight in Japan. He then went on one of the greatest lightweight tears of all time. He defeated Joe Stevenson for the vacant UFC lightweight championship of the world and then destroyed top contenders in Sean Shirk, Diego Sanchez, Kenny Florian. It was something to behold to see someone doing that sort of thing to elite fighters. Such is the class of BJ Penn. He's fought a who's who of MMA. He beat Takanori Gomi. He's fought GSP. He's fought Frankie Edgar. He's fought everybody. And I love BJ Penn as a fighter. I love to see him fight. There's been some people that have said that he should stay retired. Obviously, his last fight was his third fight and third loss to Frankie Edgar in a fight where he was pretty soundly defeated. But BJ looks motivated. He's training with Jackson Winklejohn in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They've got a great camp there with Donald Cerrone and John Jones and Holly Holm, and a list of past champions have been through Jackson Wink. And you know what? BJ Penn's a living legend, and I think he has earned the right to fight whenever he wants. He will be taking on Dennis Siver at featherweight at UFC 199 in June, and if BJ wants to fight, then I say we should let him bloody fight. I'm very, very excited. Congratulations to the prodigy BJ Penn. He will be making his return to the UFC. It's now official. And speaking of official announcements, also this week it was signed into law the legalization of mixed martial arts in the state of New York. And the UFC took that occasion to announce that they will be holding UFC 205 in Madison Square Garden in November, the world's most famous arena. Lorenzo Fertitta, who's one of the co-owners of the UFC, announced at that event that there would be a title fight on the card, and also mentioned that Ronda Rousey would be potentially making an appearance at Madison Square Garden as well. I think there's a lot of fights that then instantly get thrown into our consciousness as fight fans. First and foremost, I would say Chris Weidman, if he gets past Luke Rockhold at UFC 199, would almost certainly be on that card for UFC 205. He's a proud New Yorker. That could potentially be the title fight being discussed. Also, John Jones, another New Yorker, is about to fight over in St. Preux for the interim UFC light heavyweight championship of the world. If he gets past OSP, it's not out of the question that his title unification fight with Daniel Cormier could also be at Madison Square Garden as well. So that would be a huge event if either of those fights or both were on top. And of course, Ronda Rousey in the conversation. With the recent announcement that Miesha Tate would be defending her title against Amanda Nunes, it very much opens up the possibility of a rematch between Holly Holm and Ronda Rousey, a rematch from UFC 193 in Melbourne. I think that would be a great fight, but as a fan, I still think the fight to make is Ronda versus Cyborg. Cyborg obviously has got to get past Leslie Smith at UFC 198, but I think Ronda versus Cyborg in Madison Square Garden would be huge business. It would make a truckload of money for both fighters as well as the UFC, and it'd be bloody exciting to watch as a fan. So in the coming months, I'm sure those fights will start to come together for UFC 205, and I cannot wait for it. I think it really, you only get one chance to make a first impression, and if there's one thing the UFC is great at, it's making an impression. So New York fight fans, you're in for a treat. So stay tuned and enjoy the ride. Speaking of fights, another sensational fight card coming up this weekend, UFC Fight Night on Fox from Tampa, Florida. It's a fight card that has been in absolute shambles for a variety of different reasons. The card we are going to get tomorrow, as of the recording of the podcast, is nothing like the card that was scheduled when the card was first announced. Just to look at the main card, for example, originally it was supposed to be Khabib Nurmagomedov taking on Tony Ferguson in the main event. Tony Ferguson has since had to withdraw with injury. We were supposed to have Rashad Evans taking on Shogun Rua. Shogun had to withdraw with injury. Just this week, the fight between Dan Henderson and Lyoto Machida was scrapped after Machida was flagged for a potential anti-doping violation. It's just been an absolute cluster as far as getting this card together. And again, that raises an important sort of a discussion from this week as well, and that's the number of fighters that have been flagged for these potential anti-doping violations by ASADA. Just in the last week alone, Frank Mir was flagged for a potential violation from his fight in Brizzy versus the Super Samoan Mark Hunt. From the same card, Brazilian fighter Viscardi Andrade was flagged for his win over Aussie Filthy Rich Walsh. Machida now has been flagged for the same sort of thing. And then just this morning at the weigh-ins, Islam Makhachev was notified that he had been flagged for an anti-doping violation potentially on the morning of the weigh-ins for his fight. It's very, very frustrating as a fight fan because I know cards are subject to change and injuries are something that you can't help. Fighters are training hard to try and get in optimum shape for to stand in a cage and fight somebody, and you want to make sure you're on top of your game. And when you're training that hard, injuries are inevitable. It's disappointing, but you can't help it. But the drug tests and the drug potential violations are very, very frustrating as a fan. With Machida, his situation is a little bit different. He declared a supplement that he was taking when ASADA came to test him. And they more or less said to him, this is on the banned list. And he said, well, I've been taking it, so there you go. And they withdrew him from his fight with Dan Henderson. It's just, with more stringent testing, I think these flaggings are going to become more frequent, but it's just something that we have to sort of put up with as fight fans if they're going to clean up the sport. Machida says that he didn't know it was a banned substance. I tend to believe him, maybe naively, maybe not, but he seems like an honourable fighter. You've only got to see the way he fights. He's very respectful to his opponents. A perfect example was the Mark Munoz fight when he dropped Mark Munoz with a head kick, and when he realised he was out, he more or less called the fight off himself and then immediately tended to Mark Munoz to make sure he was okay. He seems like a stand-up guy, a very good character, and it's very disappointing that this rematch with Dan Henderson fell through. But if there is any good news to come out of that situation, it's that Dan Henderson already has another opponent booked. Reports from the States suggest he will be taking on our very own adopted Aussie Hector Lombard at UFC 199, which should be an absolute cracker of a fight. So there is a silver lining as far as Dan Henderson's concerned. But having said that too, this weekend, UFC on Fox from Tampa, it's still a great card. Top to bottom, there's really something for everyone. Even the Fight Pass prelims, we've got former UFC flyweight title challenger John Dodson taking on Manny Gamburian. Cesar Mutanch Fajera taking on one of the best names in MMA, Uluwali Bamboje. It just makes Brad Williams sound so plain. On the prelim card, we've got former UFC bantamweight title challenger Betch Correia taking on Raquel Pennington. If you fancy a few bucks on the fight, Betch Correia is a $2.78 outsider taking on Raquel Pennington. I reckon there's absolute value there. I'm also a rubbish punter, so take that into account before you go and slam your money down on my recommendation. But if you were going to have a few bucks on it, I think there's value there. What I think could potentially be fight of the night in Beneil Dariush taking on Michael Chiesa. Beneil Dariush has just been on an absolute tear. And for me, Michael Chiesa, I've never seen a fighter improve so much, so quickly, except for maybe Tony Ferguson. I love Chiesa. I love the way he fights. That fight has got barn burner written all over it. It's your sleeper for fight of the night. The main card sees perennial featherweight contender Cub Swanson taken on Nova União product Hakron Diaz. He trains in Brazil with the likes of former UFC featherweight champion Jose Aldo, former bantamweight champion Renan Barão. They've got a great team there. That could be a cracker. Khabib Nurmagomedov, the former main eventer, is taken on a short notice replacement in Daryl Horcher, making his UFC debut. The co-main event could be a sensational fight as well, with two of the top women's strawweight fighters in the world. Rose Namajunas taking on Tisha Torres. The girls are both relatively inexperienced. Tisha Torres is 7-0 in her professional career. Rose Namajunas is 4-2. She's coming off that huge win over Paige Van Zandt. A lot of people call that a massive upset, but I think it's easy to get swayed by the hype machine. And Paige Van Zandt had a whole lot of hype coming into that fight with Rose Namajunas. You've only got to have a pair of eyes to see that she's absolutely gorgeous, but she's also a sensational fighter, and the UFC was well and truly behind her coming into that fight with Rose Namajunas, and Rose Namajunas put on a clinic. Paige Van Zandt taking nothing away from her. She showed unbelievable toughness in that fight before ultimately being submitted in the 5th round, but Rose Namajunas announced her arrival on the scene, and Tisha Torres, as her record would suggest, at 7-0, she's undefeated, and just these girls are both exceptional strikers. Very, very fun to watch. They have fought previously in Invicta Fighting Championship. Tisha Torres picked up a decision victory, but both girls have improved in leaps and bounds since that first fight. So the co-main event is going to be an absolute cracker. And if nothing else, with all these changes that have happened to the card through injury and suspension and things of that nature, it gives the women's strawweight fighters an opportunity to shine in a really high-profile position. And I'm really looking forward to that fight. And the main event will feature former UFC light heavyweight champion of the world, Rashad Evans, taking on former UFC light heavyweight title challenger, Glover Teixeira. It's a very, very important fight for both fighters. Rashad Evans is coming off a loss in his most recent fight to Ryan Bader by decision. Glover Teixeira is in the process of turning things around. He challenged John Jones for the light heavyweight title and unfortunately came up short there. He then also suffered a loss to Phil Davis, but since then he's put together back-to-back wins. He's got a submission victory over Ovin St. Preux and a vicious TKO victory over Patrick Cummins. Both fighters will put themselves straight back into the conversation with a win at UFC on Fox tomorrow. I think Glover, I would love to see him fight Alexander Gustafsson if he gets past Rashad Evans. I think that would be an absolute perler of a fight. It's just going to be, it really is, of the utmost importance for both fighters. They've both been fighting a long time. Wins are very, very important for both gentlemen, and I think we, the fans, are the beneficiaries, because hopefully this whole card, potentially, it could be sensational, but if it pans out the way that we're hoping it to, it's going to be a great day to be a fight fan. If you want to check it out, you can catch the UFC Fight Pass prelims at 6:30 a.m. Sunday morning, Australian Eastern Standard Time. The prelim card kicks off at 8 a.m. on Fox Sports, and the main card kicks off at 10 a.m. also on Fox Sports. So with that said, that brings us to the end of another edition of the Big Bad Brad Show MMA. Once again, I really do appreciate you checking out the podcast. It's fantastic that people care enough to check it out, and I really do appreciate it. You can find us on Twitter at Big Bad Brad MMA, Facebook.com/Big Bad Brad MMA, and we are now on YouTube. Just search Big Bad Brad Show MMA on YouTube, and you'll be as right as rain. Thank you so much for checking us out. Enjoy the fights tomorrow, and I'll catch you next time.